Okay, I'm continuing the setup of the software for my Phat Pocket Arcade, which is right here, the second iteration of the 3D printed case for my homebrew console. And actually, before I plug this in, let me show you the couple of first iterations of the model when they were 3D printed. So, for example, here are these parts that I had modeled first, and I actually had the idea of having this back lid that would allow the access to the insides of the case, and that didn't work out too well because these edges had way too small details for the 3D printer to actually print properly. And also some of the parts of the model were too thin that they weren't strong enough to when they were exerted some pressure on while assembling, so they sort of broke apart. So I had to go back to the model and remodel it a little bit to make it work. Here's another example. This is actually from inside of the control panel, and this is the part that houses the buttons and the thumbstick. And you can see here there are like grooves and slots for those components. But underneath, I had an idea of having this connector, which would be 3D printed and would fit exactly to the arcade bonnet pins that I soldered on the arcade bonnet. But the problem was that the way the 3D printers work, that they actually print it from the bottom to top, and when you have these kinds of extensions in the model, what the 3D printer has to do is that it has to print this support structure, a mesh of plastic there, and you have to rip it apart or rip it away and smooth it afterwards. And I have such small details here that they really couldn't be printed this way. They could have been printed this way properly, but then this other side would have been maybe the components wouldn't have been fit because there was the same problem on the bottom side when printed that way. So I actually removed this detail completely and decided to wire or use a separate connector to wire to the pins, and that way I managed to actually put together the console first time. So right now I'm the state that I actually have the all the wires and the also the thumbstick wires working. So I'm gonna continue with the software setup, and to do so, to do so I need to connect this to monitor now inside the case. So I'm gonna plug it the HDMI cable inside here using a an adapter, and then there are USB connector for the mouse and keyboard right here through a USB hub, using this other the middle connector here, which is the USB for peripherals. And then there is the USB for power, which is on the Raspberry Pi. It's here in the edge. So I'm gonna plug this in very shortly, but before I do that, actually I of course have to put in the SD card, and this is an SD card adapter that I used when I burned the image using Etcher, and here is the card. So I'm gonna just use this conveniently designed slot, and right in the card goes. And now we are ready to try to start the console for the first time after burning, or after creating the SD card. Actually, now it's connected to the monitor, so let me turn the monitor on also and plug the console in. You can see that the display lit up, and but the display doesn't have any drivers yet, so I'm gonna switch over to the monitor, adjusting the camera a little bit while I do so. Let's go higher. And you can see that the RetroPie is booting in my console. Now we got the splash screen from RetroPie appearing, so everything seems to be going smoothly now. The burning of the SD card went well. The hardware is booting from the SD card, and it's time to start the rest of the setup. There are several stages in that, so I'm gonna do several videos of setting up the a little bit about the overclocking, the display drivers, the arcade bonnet drivers which are needed, and so on. And finally, of course, the game. But let's wait for the boot sequence to finish, so we can move on to the very first step, and that's configuring the keyboard for RetroPie. I'm going to configure the just the ordinary keyboard, which is connected via USB, to use the RetroPie menus first, and after I've managed to install the necessary software for the arcade bonnet, I can actually start using the RetroPie menus using those buttons and thumbstick on my Pocket console itself. Okay, let's wait a bit until the boot sequence goes through. First time it takes a little bit of more time than, and you can see now the EmulationStation, which is the core of the RetroPie distribution, the actual emulator software booting up right now. And okay, we are presented with the welcome screen, and the first thing to do with RetroPie is to configure a gamepad. I of course have a gamepad arcade bonnet inside my Pocket game console, but it doesn't have the necessary drivers yet, so I cannot use that. So I'm gonna press my keyboard buttons to let the RetroPie know that I have a keyboard, and then map the keys to the ones to the gamepad keys that the RetroPie supports. So for example, the directional keys, I'm gonna just use the cursor keys, just pressing them. So this way I can configure those. I'm gonna use insert for start button, delete button for select, and AB for A and B, XY for X and Y keys. And then rest of these additional buttons I'm not gonna bother to configure here, because in my case my game doesn't need them, and not all the arcade button inputs actually are in use in my console. I could, if I had more buttons in my console, I could map these later on if I would have a game that would need them, but my game doesn't really need them, so I'm gonna skip these. I'm gonna skip them by I'm skipping them by just keeping enter pressed, which skips the corresponding key definition here in the configuration dialog, as you can see. Since there's lots of different kinds of game controllers that you can connect to RetroPie and use them, there are a lot of options for different kinds of buttons here. And finally, I'm gonna skip the hotkey enable, and then I'm gonna press A for OK. And okay, I'm gonna confirm that I don't need a hotkey enable button for now. Yes, and now the keyboard configuration should be complete. Yes, we are now in the RetroPie menu, and that doesn't have too much at the moment. It just has the configuration option, and I'm gonna start by configuring Wi-Fi and also the display resolution, but let's take a short break here and continue the setup in the next video.